and governance with Shri Varun Gandhi. I extend a warm welcome to Shri Gandhi on our campus today. Shri Firoz Varun Gandhi is a second-term member of Parliament who represented the Coveted constituency in 2009 and was elected from the Sultanpur constituency in 2014, winning both elections by record margins. He was the youngest ever National Secretary of the Times, Rajasthan Patrika and Hindustan. Shri Gandhi also writes in other important regional languages for Lokmat, Malayala Manorama, Sambar, Vijayawani, among others, making him the widest read columnist in the country, reaching over 200 million readers. A poet by inclination, Shri Gandhi has published 2 best-selling volumes of poetry, named The Otherness of Self and Stillness. Stillness broke all sales records by becoming the best-selling non-fiction of the year 2015, selling over 10,000 copies in its first 2 days of release. He is currently working on his 3rd book of poetry titled. He donated 1 crore of his own money while crowdfunding locally across the state of Uttar Pradesh for this initiative. He visited over 20 districts over a span of 1.5 years and managed to raise over 28.6 crore rupees, which was immediately deposited in the accounts of the said farmers. In this manner, over 4,700 farmers became debt-free. His latest initiative, Sapno Ka Ghar, is to provide permanent structured homes to people who have never owned or lived in them even in previous generations. He started with a personal donation of 100 homes in his constituency of Sultanpur. Since then, the movement has built 1,000 homes across 9 districts, reaching out to the local elite as well as large farmers to contribute. His aim has been to provide the homeless with a psychological and material cushion while also providing them a sense of honor and community. It is our absolute honor to have such a distinguished person amongst us with today. Now I would welcome Professor Dr. C. Rajkumar to deliver the welcome.
A very good evening to all of you. It is indeed my proud privilege to welcome Mr. Varun Gandhi. I am very delighted that as we celebrate our 10th anniversary, we've had the privilege of hosting Mr. Gandhi at our campus. In the short meeting that we had together in my office, along with some of our faculty members, we had a wonderful discussion demonstrating the rigorous intellect, but most importantly, a very fun-loving personality that we have in Mr. Gandhi here. So I'm very delighted that he had taken his time to visit our campus amidst his very busy schedule as a parliamentarian and also as a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. I also want to mention that, as it was remarked earlier, Mr. Gandhi's sort of broader engagement in public discourse goes beyond his role and responsibility as a parliamentarian. He has always chosen to speak his mind regardless of the political party affiliations that he might belong to. And in that sense, he has developed an independent mind which is reflected in his broader educational experiences in different parts of the world. We are also very delighted to know his broader eclectic interests, which is also brought to bear the complexity in which India is governed, and he deeply participates in those public discourses by his articles, by his publications, and also by his speeches. So once again, I am grateful to Mr. Gandhi for taking his time out to be present here. For all of us who have had the privilege to be part of this discussion, I'm sure we will be enlightened by his talk, but also the discussion that will follow his talk. With that, I have great pleasure in inviting Mr. Varun Gandhi to begin this session on rights, politics and governance.
Professor Murthy, Professor Amit Jyoti Sandhu, thank you for introducing me, and thank you all for being here. I'm not actually going to be speaking on rights, etc., only because what I really I've just finished a book which is going to come out in December, which is, as you said, realizing India's future through her villages. It's sort of a rural manifesto. and I've spent 3 years writing it because I wanted to spend about a year and a half really doing primal data collection. Because most books that you read nowadays are that you read 10 books and then they are compiled into the 11th book that you write, which is really not the point of writing a book. A book is written to add to the body of knowledge, not just to replicate it. And so really, one of the streams which I want to speak to you about today, which I have noticed as a meta-narrative across India, is citizen initiatives. And that is really something that sparks both hope within me, and also it sparks a feeling that the solution doesn't lie in the system as we see it. And so what is the bridge between the present and the future? And frankly, how are young people catalysts to get there? So last year, a 12-year-old boy from Hyderabad called Ravi Teja noticed potholes on the road. And instead of going to the municipality, he just got broken bits of gravel and stone and brick, and he started filling the potholes. And everybody was very excited about this in Hyderabad. But Bangalore, in fact, got hold of him. And they said, we have a real problem with potholes, and so what would you suggest? So he and his friends at the age of, 12, 13, 14, made an app for the city of Bangalore. And it's called the Bbmp Pothole Reporter. And it's very interesting. So if you report a pothole on this app, if it's not fixed within 24 hours, you get 100 rupees in your account for every day that it's not fixed. And that 100 rupees is taken from the engineer who's supposed to be in charge of fixing it. Many of you have heard of the example of Firoz Shah and Harbans Mathur in Mumbai fixing the Versova beach. And one day they went on the beach and they said, forget human beings. There aren't even any stray dogs on this beach because it's so dirty. And they, instead of going to the BMC or whatever, they just rolled up their sleeves, and they put rubber gloves on. They started picking up trash. And now if you go to Bombay, on the weekends, you see about 500 people on that 5-6 kilometer line of beach. And it's the cleanest and the most hygienic beach in Mumbai today. And these are citizen initiatives. There's a lot of talk about the Me Too movement today. And what started with one girl, Tarana Burke, putting it out, and then Alyssa Milano agreed with her, and she put the hashtag Me Too. And that's how this really started. And what interests me about the Me Too movement is not just the examples of justice that we have currently before us, but also that it's revitalized feminism as a whole. So it's opened up discussions that were not possible. For instance, the discussion of gender pay discrimination, which is a huge discussion today that's going on, and that will take, society forward. Not so far from here is a district called Mewat, which is one of the poorest districts in northern India and one of the most uneducated. A woman in Mewat heard about the Me Too movement, and while she didn't quite comprehend what the whole thing was about, she realized it was a movement, progressive movement to make women have an equal playing field. And then she noticed that the people in her village and around, most adult women were uneducated. They were illiterate, completely illiterate. So she went around and she said, okay, if I start evening classes, because they work during the day, will you all come? And this one woman is responsible over the last 1 year for over 400 women becoming functionally literate today. So it takes one person, and look at look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? So I was in New York at the time, and I was living with my friend in the financial district, in fact on Wall Street, just off Broad Street. And I remember all these people outside Goldman Sachs, outside the stock exchange, were putting up these tents, etc. I thought, these guys are just hippies, right? They're just having a good time. And what came out of that movement? Bernie Sanders, the most popular politician in America today, popular because of young people like you, who's actually 80 years old. He came out of that movement, right? Jeremy Corbyn, at the margins of British politics, is today the presumptive prime minister going into the next election. So it changed politics, and these were one-issue politicians, right, who were talking about economic inequality. In India, we're the most unequal we've ever been. The British Economic Gazette states that in the time where Rajas and Maharajas had their largest landownings structures, 1% of India owned 22% of India. Today, 1% of India owns 60% of India. 10% of India owns 91% of India. That means 90% of people in India own 9% of Indian assets. That's not only shameful, it's also frightening. It doesn't make for a good country going forward. So last year, a few years ago actually, a retired teacher from Alwar in Rajasthan called Deepchand Sharma sent a letter to the Prime Minister's office saying that he had saved 10 lakh rupees and he wanted to give it to the 10 poorest people in India. And so he got a letter back saying that we have no idea who the 10 poorest people in India are. And he said, all right, can you give it to 10 out of the 10,000 poorest people in India? And he got his checks back saying we have no idea who the 10,000 poorest people in India are. Now, I just thought this was interesting because we're always going on and on about how there are 84 billionaires, and every time some, internet nerd becomes a billionaire, his pictures in E.T. Panache, and you see his new house and his new Lamborghini or whatever. And I thought it's bizarre that in this fog, maybe the last man of society is completely disappeared. And I look at inequality, from an economic standpoint, but it's also important to look at it from a human rights standpoint. So one of the things that, would any of you like a glass of water? Because I think somebody's throats are really bad. Anyway, so I was looking at water, right? Water is a fundamental resource. And I went to Marathwada in Maharashtra, which is a very water-starved area, a group of districts. And I was in Latur, and the chief minister did something very good, which is he sent a water train out, and with 500,000 liters of water. And the train was looted 16 times. It was looted for 5 liters of water and 10 liters of water. And I thought that was, a bit odd. And then I went to Bombay to give a lecture after my 2 weeks there. And on my way, when I was driving to TIS, I saw this huge hoarding that said Aquaria Grand, where there are 200 apartments and 200 swimming pools. And I thought that's weird because they said we want to emulate life in an aquarium. Why anybody would want to live in an aquarium, I have no idea. But I just thought it was so cruel and, almost farcical that while people in, an area of Maharashtra were looting trains for water, 5 liters and 10 liters, some builder was building a building with 200 full-size swimming pools in it. I just thought it was bizarre. And then I started looking at water more carefully. And I realized that there are 36 districts in Maharashtra, and 3 districts, Mumbai, Pune and Thane, get 59% of the water. And when I asked the water minister that what is the reason for this, he said, look, it's a monetized resource, right? People who can pay for it will get it more. And that sent a shiver up my spine. And if you look at even something as basic as rural versus urban, right? So 71% of the population lives in rural or semi-rural areas, and they get 29% of the water. The same in Haryana, the same in Gujarat, the same in Tamil Nadu, the same in state after state after state. What does it mean? And it's pretty obvious. So the real question is that does inequality lead to injustice? And the answer is that it does. So I was in Punjab, I was at a university, and I read something in the Tribune, and it said, it was somebody who had written a letter in requesting for security, and I said, oh, these people live in Delhi, so I called them. And they lived in Tilak Nagar, which is, largely a resettlement area for Sikh refugees. And I called them and I said, can I be of any service to you? And they said, look, 25 years ago, my brother disappeared with a police officer, right? And we never saw him ever again. And we thought that the police officer murdered my brother. It's a guy called Ashish Kumar from Ludhiana. And the CBI also thought so, because they put murder charges on the cop. And I said, well, I suppose, it's karmic retribution, because you obviously ruined the cop's career, right? Because obviously he was never going to get a promotion after that. They said he's the sitting Director General of Police in Punjab, Sumed Singh Saini. He had murder cases on him. When you have the top cop with murder cases on him, that does not bode well for a, judicious system. I was in Odisha a week ago, and all of you heard the story of Gati Dhibar, who walked with his child, dead child, on his shoulders for 15 kilometers because the ambulance wouldn't give him a ride because he wouldn't pay the 50 rupees bribe. And this story was shocking. But the story I read was even more shocking, which was in Navrangpur district. A man goes into a bank and he says that I want 50,000 rupees for the season of cropping that's about to come. And they say, sure. And by mistake, the teller writes another zero. So it's 5 lakhs. And the guy, says, listen, you've written this wrong. And he says, oh yeah, that's right, I've written it wrong, but I've got a wedding in my family, so I've got to go right now. But I promise you tomorrow morning I'll come in first thing and you come in first thing, and I'll just correct it, and it's no skin of your back. Everything will be fine. I'll take care of it because it is an honest mistake. The man went outside and he hung himself on a tree outside the bank. He didn't even have that much faith in the system that, he could live with that psychological loan, because it wasn't even a real loan, for more than 1 hour. And you see these examples again and again and again. When I was fighting my second election, I was driving from Lucknow to Kanpur, and there's a district in between called Unnao. And I was there and I saw these big hoardings, and it said, Gaurav Shukla ko jitao, Gaurav Shukla ko bachao. Which, for those who don't understand Hindi, says, make Gaurav Shukla victorious and also save Gaurav Shukla. And I thought, that's weird. We fight elections to save other people. And so I said, what does this gentleman need to be saved of? And they said, oh yeah, he's got some case on him. I said, okay. So then I did a little bit of homework, and I found that actually he was accused of raping a 13-year-old child. And not only raping her, but pouring acid all over her face so that she would be too scared to tell anybody. And I thought, it's weird that a political party would give a ticket to a guy like this. Anyway, so the election got over and I won my seat, and I came to Parliament and I spoke in Parliament, and I called up the Director General of Police, UP. And I said, what about this case? And he said, I said, what are you talking about? I said, why isn't this case over? And he said, actually, we're just figuring out whether he was an adult when he did this or whether he was a child. And I said, anybody who's old enough to rape is old enough to be tried as an adult, frankly. And we went back and forth. Anyway, I went public with this, I spoke on it, and I'm happy to say that the case, which for 6 years was lingering, and you know why, today the guy's been convicted and he's in jail for the rest of his life. So I'm happy about that. That normally should get some claps. This is a difficult audience. So, we often hear about young people, right? Youth is such a big buzzword, but really, which young people are we talking about? There are 13 crore young people in our country who have no access to education, no jobs, and no training. That's 30% of all young people between the ages of 17 and 35, right? So what are the young people, and I'm going to talk about institutionalized inequality in a minute. We talk about IT, right? I don't know if there are any tech students here, but NASSCOM has just done a study, and I want you to look at it if you can. It says they interviewed 30,000 tech students, engineering, tech, computer science, from the top institutes in India, and they only found 6% of them with the basic, with 6% of them with the basic knowledge to get an entry-level job in an MNC. 6%, right? So when I was at the National Law School, Bangalore, last month, and I was speaking there, and I went to Infosys and to Wipro, and I said, why are you not hiring? Because hirings are down in Cognizant and Wipro and Infosys. And they said, you know what, it costs us too much money to retrain these guys because they don't know anything. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, see, we're looking at AI, we're looking at machine learning, we're looking at, all these things like cybersecurity. They don't really know blockchain technology, they don't know anything. And they know low-level coding, which means very little. And that's something we've all got to think about, is building jobs for the future, not building jobs for the past. And that's something in India, if our economy doesn't understand, we're going to be in terrible trouble going forward. So, does privilege perpetuate privilege? I'm an example of every institutionalized privilege that there is. So I'm happy to be talking about this. So I just want to talk, so does privilege perpetuate privilege? So I was looking at a study that was done around Harvard University, right? And it was astonishing. So the study says that 57% of all students at Harvard University currently in the year 2016-17, which means they're almost all still there, their median family income is $148,000 a year, which means they're in the top 1% of American families. 57%, right? And only 3% of all students at Harvard University belong to the bottom 10% of American economic strata. Then the students go out, and 39% of total graduates reach the top 1% income bracket by the age of 32. So it's a classic example of privilege perpetuating privilege, right? So what's the most coveted job in India for a middle-class person? Tell me. IAS, right? So it's a no-brainer. So let's talk about the IAS. So IAS are supposed to be the salt of the earth, There's supposed to be people that come from Bhagalpur and Balia and Raurkela, and they understand India, so they represent India, and so they shall serve India. But what's the truth of it? And this is the truth. An RTI that I filed says 84% of all serving IAS officers grew up and were educated in the top 20 cities of India. 84%, right? 66% of all IAS officers went to private school. 21% went to convent school, right? So who's getting into the IAS? The privileged, right? They don't have to be billionaires. They're just socially and economically more privileged than the next person. So even if we look at in India, how early this inequality and inequity really starts, right? So let's look at school level. So out of the 15.5 lakh schools in India, and this is something you probably don't know, only 1.2% are CBSE, ISC, IB, and A levels and O levels. Only 1.2%. Everything else is state board or madarsa board or some other kind of board, right? And I didn't know this, frankly, when I was researching this. And so what happens to everybody in the so-called posh boards, the CBSE, ISC, and what happens in the other boards, right? So if you look at the fees in a CBSE school, an average CBSE school, so the average fees without the additional accoutrements, without uniform and this and that, is 65,000 rupees a year, right? If you look at government socio-economic caste census data, nobody can afford that. So government says that most people in India make between 5,000 and 7,000 rupees a month. So they can't put all their money into a child's education, right? So the Supreme Court did something good in 2012. They said that 25% of your seats will be filled for economically weaker sections, which is good. But if you look at the National Protection of Child Rights Report 2018, only 21% of those seats have been filled. So, why is that happening? We're going to get to that in a minute. And let's look at IIT, right? Let's look at IIT, IIM. So we've just discovered that only 1.2% of people study in CBSE, ISC, IB, internationals, your systems, whatever, right? But what percentage of those people fill the seats in IIM? 87%. And what percentage of those people fill the seats at IIT? 79%. So it's just privilege perpetuating privilege. So either you're in that 1% or 2% or 5%, or you're nobody, or you're nothing, and you'll always be nothing. And this is the challenge of our times. Let's look at the fact that even for an IIT, right? So I don't know if any of you sat for the IIT exam or whatever, but most people who sit for the IIT exam have to take some sort of coaching to sit for it. And that coaching costs you at least 2 to 4 lakh rupees over a couple of years, right? Now, what if you don't get in? Because 12 lakh people sit for IITs and 11,000 get in. So it's not exactly a very high ratio. So what happens if you don't get in? I'll tell you. Everybody's talking about NPAs these days, right? But nobody's talking about education NPAs. Just education NPAs in India have crossed 6,000 crores this year. Just education non-performing asset loans. Everybody's heard of Rohit Vemula, but I found Arya Prakash's story even more tragic, who killed himself in IIT Madras. And he wrote the night that he killed himself, he said, I don't come from an upper class background or an upper caste background. I had no top-notch schooling. I don't speak the English language with any excellence. And education has differentiated and created a gulf which can never be put together. This is before he killed himself. And this is such a challenge because instead of working as an equalizing measure, has education served to actually institutionalize inequality? This is something we need to think about. And, I just want to say 2 or 3 things about solutions for education. Everybody's always saying that we need to spend more on education as a percentage of our GDP, right? And I'm sure that if we could do that easily, we probably would. So I don't want to say we should spend double, because there's probably some institutional reason why that's not happening. But just 2 things. One is, can we have an externship as a compulsory national program, right? So can we take, say, postgraduates and say 1 year you just teach people from the class 8 to class 12, because it's not that difficult if you're a postgraduate, or if you're an undergraduate, under class 8. And I'm sure that if it were an externship, most people would do it, right? And it would fill the gap of teachers like this. In fact, it would go 4 times. The other thing is that, have we reached an inflection point in our history where we need to think about financing education rather than providing it, right? So all over the world now, there are charter schools, right? Which are basically where you go to people who are working in the education sphere and you say, we will, fund you, but you actually run the school and adhere to the certain quality that you're used to. And then a certain amount of seats are reserved for people of weaker sections. So is that something that can be looked at? But the most important thing we need to look at in a country like India is freewheeling education. Right? So one of the things I was talking to you about, sir, is that between the ages of 18 and 21, you're not all aware of who you are and what you want to do. I know I wasn't. But how you learn is through a process of osmosis. Now, when I was 18, the internet wasn't what it is today. But today, it's not just what you're learning here, it's what you're learning on the net, it's what you're learning on, podcasts, it's what you're learning in 10 different things. And so it is more holistic, and it's also, more lateral in a different way. So can we look at non-formal education, at least for India? Because this system of colonial education has failed us, right? This system where you go to school in the morning and you wear these uniforms and you salute the flag and then you come back, and people are not going to school. They're going to school to eat and then they come back because they work, right? They don't have their labor class and their agrarian class, and they don't have the same luxuries that we had. So can you make a system which is pastoral in nature, where you you teach according to the agriculture season, right? Because if you say nobody will send their children to work as labor, that doesn't mean anything. You can't police 1 billion people. They'll send their kids anyway because they got to eat, right? So can we have, a facilitator who lives and works with rural communities according to their timetable, not according to a Delhi or Calcutta timetable? And can we have schools that also function as agri-businesses? See, a lot of reasons why people don't send their kids to school is because they frankly need them to earn, right? You got 7 kids, what do? So if you actually, I was in Paraguay, in Central America, and there they have something called Fundación, which is just that all these people who go to school learn to make things. The school then sells those things. They have shares in those things, and they all have bank accounts, and they all get money. So they get into the formal, system, monetized, etc. So the next thing that I really want to talk about is the most important thing that we need to look at as young people, which is the innovation economy. So over the summer, I was in America, and I went and met Jeff Bezos. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Bezos, how come your company came to India and was number 1 on day 1, Amazon, right? And he seemed a bit, he was a bit chuckled with that. And I said, but I don't understand, right? How can a company come into an alien country which frankly is skeptical about something so new, and be number one with 60% market share on day one. Basically, Flipkart died the day Amazon came, right? They were forced to sell themselves. Otherwise, they would have been bankrupt in 3 months. So what happened? So what he said to me is amazing. And those of you who are setting up businesses should really learn from this. He said 8 years before we came to India, we hired 3,000 people to do market research. 8 years before. And he said we found 3 things out. One, that people have a lot of smartphones, but they're cheap smartphones. So they have low battery and they will crash if you put in a high powered app. So we need a very small app. Second, that the trading community in India is very strong, it's very united, and it's very vocal. So if we're seen to be, disruptors in that, they will come on the streets and we'll be thrown out like Coca-Cola was in 77, etc., etc. And the third thing is that the Indian people should see us as part of them rather than seeing us like an East India company that's coming in and dominating the economy. And so what did he do is very interesting. He cut the size of his app. He is the only country in the world for which Amazon gives a handling fee to the local Kirana store. So if you go to a local store and you say, I want to buy Pampers for my child on Amazon, they get 1% handling fees. The only country in the world where they do that. And the third thing is that they launch things like Amazon Tatkal, where anybody, you can actually, in half an hour, if you give verification of product, you can actually sell stuff on it. So everybody feels that in their victory lies their own victory. And I thought that was very intelligent. And so, this is thinking for the future. This is a process of implementing new ideas to create value for your organization. Right? Now, let's look at India, for instance, as an economy. Right? So what is the state of innovation? How many R&D people do we have in India? We have 300 R&D people per million. In Germany, they have 10,000. Right? Just, whether we look at something like how much are we spending? So our spending on R&D as a percentage of GDP is 0.5 or 0.6, right? In countries like Israel or even South Korea and countries like that, it's 7%, right? So they're doubling down on the new economy. So what is the reason? So India has the largest amount of startups in the world, and 91% of our startups fail in year 3, right? By year 3. Why? It's very simple. Because Indian fund managers and investors don't look at the long term. They're not saying build a meta-level startup, build a Baidu or an Alibaba. They're saying just rip off some American startup, make Ghana for Spotify, right? Make Oyo rooms for Airbnb. Just make some junk, rip it off, and put an Indian tag on it. Right? Now, that is not the way you build great countries. There's no meta-level startup in India. Now, what is the reason for this? The reason for this is that we haven't really spent on education in the correct way. So the Right to Education program has spent 300,000 crores, right? 89% of that money has been spent on building buildings. That's it. Now, we all know why politicians love to build stuff, right? But the truth is that if you think about it, right, it's a crime because you go to a village, it's like 5 kilometers from here, you go to a village, and I guarantee you that you have a structure which is a school, and what is the school used for? It's used for marriages, it's used to feed people, it's used to hang out when it's raining or when it's really bad weather. It's used for politicians to give speeches at election time. It's used for funeral rites. It is used for everything other than teaching. And why? Because the teachers aren't there. Because the people are too poor to be incentivized for formal education. So we really need to look at this further. But the real two things that I want to focus on very briefly are one, do any of you watch Shark Tank? Okay, so the first question that they ask is this patented, right? You have a patent on this. So what is the state of Indian patents, right? So last year, 89% of all patents in India were by foreigners. 89 of all patents in India. In America, the average time to be granted either a utility or a design patent is between 6 and 8 months. In India, the average time is 6 years. In 6 years, your technology is completely obsolete. Frankly, in 1 year, your technology is obsolete, right? So that's crazy. I mean, all of you have heard that India was called a Sone ki Chidiya, right? A golden bird. But what you probably haven't heard is that it was Vasco da Gama who said it. Have you woken up? You were sleeping through all my lecture. Thank you. It's the greatest compliment that I could have received. I would have named her, but I'm not that guy. So Vasco da Gama lands in Calicut, right? And he's not here for the beaches, right? He lands here because he's looking for calico, which is unfinished cotton. He's looking for silk. At that time, India truly was a golden bird, because he famously said, India is like a golden bird waiting to take flight. 44% of Indian GDP was textile. 44%. Today it's not even 2%, right? Bangladesh's economy is booming because they're only focused on textile, right? When my book comes out, if you happen to read it, one of the things I've talked about is what should India be focused on? So I really don't want to be talking about steel because I'm a Jindal, but lest I am driven to an undisclosed location and not heard from again. But I will say this, to create one job in textile, right, in handloom, costs you 9,000 rupees to create one job. To create one job in steel costs you 400,000 rupees. So in a country where we need jobs, really what should we be focused on? See, because when you go to a village, the first thing they'll tell you is, factory lagao. Put up a factory, give us jobs. Because it's that old socialist thinking, right? Put up a factory. But all those factories today are lying empty and vacant and dusty. And all the land of those farmers is gone, has become arid. You know, so I was at NASA in Houston about 10 years ago. And I went there, and when I went to the cafeteria, I thought I was in Hyderabad. You know, because I only heard Telugu being spoken. And I said, and I asked the person who was showing us around, I said, could you tell me how many people work here and how many of them are Indian? And he laughed and he said, I will definitely tell you that. And about 4 days later, he told me there are 3,700 people that work in Houston at NASA, 2,100 are Indian. So what is the state of Indian research in India, right? Not such a happy state. So the highest job you can get really doing research in India is for about 3 or 4 lakhs a year. You can't even run a family on that. And in America, the average salary for a PhD in science or tech or research or, you know, biomedical engineering or whatever is $140,000. You know, so you're well taken care of. Also, what do we do with our PhDs, right? If you do a PhD from IIT, why is it worth nothing? And I'll tell you why. Because who do you get judged by? You get judged by peer-reviewed journals that nobody reads. They go in the bin. When was the last time you read an IIT journal? You didn't. right? I don't think anybody at IIT did either. But if you do a PhD in England or in Australia or in America or in Canada or wherever, you are industry linked, right? If you do, say, biochemical engineering, you will be asked to test your hypothesis with Pfizer, right? To test whether what you've written is just junk or whether it really adds something to the real world out there. And we have 91,000 Indians with PhDs in America. 91,000. Right? So Indians are smart people. We just need a system which encourages us rather than which binds us. Right? I want to talk about the environment, which is my big issue that I think about all the time. And I want to thank you, for not giving me flowers. Because wherever I go, they always give me a bouquet of flowers. And I always say that, this is such an oxymoronic thing because flowers are dead things. You kill flowers to give them to somebody. So flowers can never be the start of a relationship, right? Which is why when I was wooing my wife, I used to take her potted plants. And that is why after marriage I had to buy a whole load of diamonds. It evens out. So not too far from here is the Bandwari waste treatment plant, which is the waste treatment plant for Faridabad and Gurgaon. It has not worked in 7 years. It has not worked. All that carcinogen is leaching into the earth. There are 2 villages next to the Bandwari waste treatment plant called Dera and Bandwari. 90% of people in both villages have cancer. 90%. I went to give a lecture at Nalsar in Hyderabad, and my friend Professor Faizan Mustafa, who heads it, he said, I'm going to take you for lunch to the Falak Numa. And I said, no, I want to see the Musi River. And he said, what? And I said, I want to see the Musi River. He said, the Musi River isn't like the Thames or anything. So I was like, yeah, I want to go see it. So we went, and he had never seen it. And the Musi River is red like this. It is red. And the Hindu, which is one of the papers that I write for, did a full-page story on it. It was an excellent story. And they called it the world's biggest cancer circle. Because 1.5 lakh people live on the side of it. 70% of them have cancer, right? Now, why is this happening? Because Hyderabad is the biggest generic drug producer in Asia. I think you know this. 30% of all cheap drugs come from Hyderabad. Now, in this mad race to produce cheap drugs, all these companies just put their garbage, their liquid waste into the river. Why did this river become famous? Because the University of Heidelberg and the University of Leipzig did a report on how all the fish in the Musi River both had male and female genitalia. Right? Because when you mess with nature, nature messes back with you. And that's really, really frightening. I was watching CNN the other day, and I was watching the Tompkins Conservation Project. Have you heard of it? So the Tompkins are this husband and wife duo who own this clothing company called the North Face. And they just, said, we want to leave the earth better than where we found it. So they bought vast tracts of land in Patagonia between Argentina and Chile. And they just regreened it. They reforested it. And they created ecosystems. Today, the jaguar, which is completely extinct, has come back there. And I just think that an institution like this one, if you could do just 2 things. One is just take the roads outside on both sides, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, and take a day at this season, which is the right season to plant, and just plant fruit trees on both sides. I'm sure you can afford gardeners who, after you plant them, with those protectors, will go and water them for 3 years and then they're on their own. Because see, the idea is not to make money and get a good job and go ahead, right? You're going to do that anyway. But what you're going to remember about this time is the interesting stuff that you did, right? And the interesting stuff is not the stuff that Justice Kavanaugh did when he was in college. The interesting stuff is, what you never thought you would do, right? And that, when I went to my constituency, I went from village to village, and they would not say to me that we want roads and we want bridges. They would say, we're hungry, we're hungry, hum bhookhe hain. And it really, it just shattered me, because nobody had ever said that to me. And my friend Captain Naseeb Sandhu, who's with me, he said to me that, why don't we start something new? And we started a project which failed, which is, we said to them, give us whatever waste food you have and we'll process it and give it. But somebody gave, cauliflower, and somebody gave aubergine, and somebody gave curd, and we couldn't make anything of it. So then we said, we'll start a roti bank. And we said, everybody just give us rotis, right? The marriage halls, the hotels, the well-off people, just give us rotis. If you can spare one roti, give us one roti. Today, we're collecting 25,000 rotis a day, right? And what I do with my personal funds is, I give two vegetables, two sabzis with it. And we're feeding 5,000 people a day. And I want to scale this to about 30,000, so we make it the first hunger-free district in UP. But you can do this. Take all the waste food that you have on campus. I'm sure there's loads of it, right? And if you can just open a sort of industrial kitchen, clean it, and then give it. If Haryana is much richer than UP, so people won't take that. But even if you give it to animals, right? Even if you give it to stray dogs, right? I mean, they're as much God's creatures as we are, right? That's a thing. And the next thing that I want to talk about, which I love talking about, is political reform. Because frankly, if politics doesn't change, then the rest of this is totally meaningless. So, a year ago, I was watching television and I saw all these Tamil Nadu farmers who were in Delhi drinking their own urine and shaving their heads to protest the agrarian crisis. And I noticed that the Tamil Nadu Assembly had declared a special day for discussion. So obviously I thought it was to discuss this, but they were discussing how to increase the salaries for MLAs in Tamil Nadu to double it, which is what they did. And I thought it was really disgusting until I realized that as a member of parliament, my salary had been increased 4 times in 5 years. So it's very interesting. So if you're a doctor or a government servant or a journalist or a professor at Jindal Global University, how do you increase your salary? Right? You prove yourself, you have certain barometers, you work for a certain amount of time, you show results, right? If you're a member of parliament in India, how do you increase your salary? This is how. Literally, that's how. You just raise your hand, and everybody raises their hand, and you have given yourself a salary hike. And I thought that was, a crazy thing to do. And I got up in parliament and I said, listen. So the first thing I did was I wrote letters to every member of parliament and every MLA in India who has declared a net worth of over 20 crore rupees, right? And I said, will you voluntarily give up your salary? Because that will save India 400 crore rupees a year. I did not get one letter back. and nobody spoke to in Parliament for a really long time after that. And then what I did was I spoke in Parliament, and this was a little more serious, and I said, wait a minute, why can't we do one thing? Why can't we institute a body, right, which decides if we deserve these salary hikes? Look at our work, look at the hours we work, look at our output, look at cost of living, look at standard of living, and then it decides, right? How can we arrogate to ourselves the right to increase salary at will? It does not strike me as being democratic or fair. And so I went on and on and on and on all over the country at this. And then finally last year they did it. And they've got that. So it proves that these university lectures are not useless after all. So everybody talks, like if you ask a politician that, if you ask them any question which is difficult, they'll say, but we're representatives, right? We've won elections, right? We are the voice of the people. Is it so really? Farooq Abdullah just won an election from Srinagar. He got 4% of the vote. I myself did not get 50% of the vote, right? And I was very conscious of this. So the first thing I did after I won the second time is I called everybody who fought the election against me, and I said, let's all sit down together and let's all collectively run this constituency. Because you obviously... Today, Parliament is supposed to be a place for debate and discussion, but is it? So 51% of all bills that have been passed in Parliament in the last 15 years have been passed without any discussion, not 1 second's discussion, right? 67% of all bills that have been passed in Parliament have been passed without sending to any standing or consultative committee. But the most weird statistic is that 45% of all bills passed in Parliament are passed in the last 3 hours of Parliament concluding for that session, because A, nobody shows up, and B, all you do is say, okay, pass this bill, pass this bill, pass this bill, okay, there's nobody here, okay, show of hands, done, right? And what is Parliament supposed to do, right? Parliament's supposed to be law making. How do you pass laws in Parliament? Firstly, you're not told what you're voting on the next day. You don't even know. Nobody gives you information, you have no idea. You sit in these galleries and somebody comes by and they just say, press the green button, press the green button, press the green button. And so you press the green button and you have made a law for 1.5 billion people. Right? That strikes me as being particularly unconscionable. I want individual members of Parliament and MLAs to have voting records so that their constituents can judge them by this. Today, every member of Parliament or MLA votes according to party whip, right? So you actually don't know what that MLA thinks, right? You don't know what they think about gun control, about women's rights, about gay rights, about the environment, about the labor class. You don't know anything because the party says you will take that stand, and if you don't, you're out of a seat. So what does it really come down to? So what is the solution really? So the solution are 2 or 3 different things. Say you hear Jindal, you want to have a discussion in Parliament on something. How can you? You can't, right? But in over 40 countries in the world, there's a petition system. And the petition system is this, which is 100,000 signatures, it gets you 1 hour designated in Parliament. 10,000 signatures gets you a reply within a month from the Prime Minister's office, right? If we had a system like this, so many good campaigns, Delhi, is unlivable. My daughter is 4 years old. Every day she goes to school with a mask on her face. I think I'm living in Blade Runner or something. And it's really frightening. It's not even funny. And last time, when Parliament was in session, 5 times I sent a note saying I want to discuss the Delhi pollution scenario. And 5 times the speaker said to me, this is not an important enough issue to debate. The fact that Delhi is unlivable, it's polluted beyond belief. Had it been a city in the West, that would have been the only issue that the country was talking about, right? Do we have any value for life in India at all? In Morocco, Mohammed VI was fearing after the Arab Spring that he would be next. So he said, okay, I'll give away powers and we'll build a new constitution. But people said, how will we do that? So he made a company called Reform.ma. It's a francophone country. And he said, let young people give their suggestions, right? They implemented most of them. And when the constitution was voted upon, 97% of people voted for it. So the idea is to get more people involved in decision making. You have to increase democracy, right? So everybody talks about corruption. And why is corruption there? Corruption is not there because they were waiting for a good man to come in and fix the system. There's no such thing, right? Corruption is there in India because information systems are opaque. If tomorrow you have a road being built outside your university and you want to know who's building the road because they're doing a sham job and stealing all the money, you have no way of knowing. Even if you do get to meet that person, they will say it's none of your business, right? Go back to your place. So Monithon is a confluence of Marathon and Monitor, which is all EU expenses now have a very good website which you should look at it called Monithon. So what it is every euro that is spent is accounted for to the nth degree. So if you have a bridge being built, the laborers that are working on the bridge that day, their names will be there. The ones that haven't shown up, their names will be there. Every day, the amount of work that's supposed to be done is designated. The amount of work that was done is then compared with that, right? With the reason for why it was not done. And the most important is that if you ask a question, being a citizen of the EU, you have to get a response within 8 hours, right? In India, that would be a dream. Because in India, if everybody had access to open information, there would be no corruption. Or corruption would be very limited. And the last thing about this is really collaborating with citizens on public projects. So in Rio de Janeiro, there's something called Benefitoria, which is the city votes 3 times a year, right? And it decides what projects it wants to implement. And everybody gives ideas. They then do a cost analysis of what's possible within the budget. And then the city votes, and then it's got legal sanctity. It has to be built. And if we did that in Indian cities or in Indian villages, we would get what people really want instead of these big white elephants. And I want to end my speech by giving 2 examples. One because all of you think 2 things. You think, one, I'm just one person, so what can I do? And the other, you think, life has been really tough for me. Life has been cruel to me. I've not got a fair shake. So I was looking at education, and I wanted to see why Murshidabad in Bengal went from 29% literacy to almost 90%. And it all came down to one young man called Babar Ali. So when Babar was 9 years old, he was the only kid to go to school from his village, Bhapta. And every day he would go and he would feel very guilty. So when he came back, he would sit and he would teach people under a guava tree that day. And people would come, and it became a bit of a local legend. And nobody in India heard about him, but CNN heard about him. And they gave him a Global Change Maker of the Year award, and they gave him $150,000 back in the day. And anybody else would have bought land with it, or bought a house, or bought agriculture, a tractor. And he said, no, this money has come from education, go back to education. And so he built a huge school, probably 4 times, 5 times the size of this room. And he said that there's only 3 rules. 1, everybody who studies, studies free. 2, everybody who teaches, teaches free. And 3, everybody who studies goes back to their villages and teaches 5 people what they've learned that day, right? And then other villages got competitive. And they said, if they can do it, if Bhapta, this village, can do it, why can't we do it? And so it became an education hub. And today they have 100% literacy, where they had 11% literacy in those 100 villages. One guy did it. And the other story, which is my last aside, is of Shrikant Bola. Shrikant was born in Sitaramapuram in Andhra Pradesh. He was totally blind. And his parents wanted to kill him when he was born, because they said, what will a blind child do? And his grandparents said, no, we'll keep him. So they brought him up. And he loved learning. So he applied to do science in +2. And they said, you can't, because how will you do the syllabus? And he said, he went to court in Hyderabad. And the court said the child can study whatever he wants to study. So he did science and he got 99%. And after that, he applied to IIT. And he got into IIT. He got 13 rank nationwide. That's very good. And he got into IIT Delhi. But IIT Delhi refused to take him. Because said, how will we keep a blind guy? How will he bathe? How will he eat? Will he have 2 people escorting him? We don't have that system. So he said, okay, I'll take a gap year. And he applied to MIT. And he's the first Indian to get a full scholarship from MIT. And he went to MIT and he studied astrophysics, which, as you know, is astrophysics, tough stuff. And he got a gold medal at the university. And after getting it, NASA, Google, Oracle, everybody said, come and work the United States government. They said, come and work with us. And he said, no, the idea was always to go back. And he came here and he started an industry called Bolland Industries. Today it's a 300 crore industry and hires 4,000 people. 3,000 of them are completely blind. So the next time, you think you've had it tough, remember Shrikant Bola. So I just want to end by saying that, I come to these places, I write a lot, I lecture a lot. It doesn't add any votes for me, right? But I feel that this politics that we've inherited has to stop being about the next election and start being about the next generation, right? And I'm elected from a place called Sultanpur, and I was earlier elected from Pilibhit, but I'm not an MP of those places. I'm an MP of the Union of India, right? So as much right as they have on me, you have as much right on me. And that's why I've come here. And the biggest task before all of us today is to build not just the India of our dreams, but to build a fairer and more equal country, right? And I've come here to build relationships with all of you. Are any of you on Twitter? So quite a lot of you. So I would like you to follow me. My account is, Ishita, what's my account? Varun Gandhi 80, right? Not because of anything else, but I want you to read what I'm writing. I only write on policy. And I also want you to be partners in India's future with me by telling me what you think are the issues I should be fighting for, right? Because that is the future of all public engagement. Let's build a kinder and a gentler country, and one which we all are equal stakeholders. Thank you very much.